Hi, and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Patrick Toner. He's an author, a biographer. He brings us the life of Alden Nowlan in his newly published book called If I Could Turn and Meet Myself. Welcome, Patrick.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks, Leslie.
Alden Nowlan is like one of my sort of heroes. Yeah, and I see him in Canadian literature as a kind of an unsung hero. You better give us a brief introduction into who the man was.
Alden Nowlan was known as, kind of known as New Brunswick's poet laureate, but he wasn't really from New Brunswick. He was actually from Nova Scotia. He spent the first 19 years of his life here, and then he moved to New Brunswick and became a journalist. Most Canadians and most New Brunswickers probably know him as a columnist for the New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal. He was occasional writer of articles for Maclean's magazine.
And it was his poetry, though, that really connected with the larger Canadian audience, wasn't it?
Of course. Alden Nowlan once said, you know, if there ever comes a time where truck drivers read poetry, mine will be the poetry that they'll read. Certainly ordinary readers across the country were gripped by the poetry that he wrote, yeah.
What was it that was so unique about his poetry? I noticed you included a quote there from Jane Urquhart, who had said that when she first read Alden Nowlan's poetry, the universe changed color. I know exactly what she means, but what was it that he could do?
Nowlan can do probably like no other writer had. He had this amazing emotional intelligence. He could distinguish. He could see little shades of how people use their emotions and little relationships between each other that really resonate off the page. I can give you an example if you want from one of his poems.
Sure, what's a good example?
Well, he really did this a lot during his early poems, and he wrote some beautiful, beautiful poems which hint at some of the tragedy about in human relationships and how the emotions that we have do not quite get expressed. Here's a good example. It's an early poem called Poem for the Golden Wedding of My Puritan Grandparents. He writes, "Their love was sister to the starving deer and brother to December. Had he called her darling in his annual drunkenness, for he got drunk at Christmas, her lean lips would have recoiled as when she tasted milk that had gone sour or observed a girl in little breeches. So he always spoke of her as the old lady, Ma or Maud, and in their 50 years they never kissed. But when he withered of the fanged disease that ate his vitals till he lived on slop, and sat in silence louder than a groan, we children marveled how she sometimes sat for hours, simply staring at his face, and how, before they closed the box, she bent with awful eagerness to pat his hand."
He wrote a lot about people who were down and out.
Yes.
And sometimes in the middle of that, though, he found a bit of glory, if that's the right word.
Yeah.
Is that part of his magic as a writer?
Yes, that's part of it too, and it comes from that emotional intelligence. You know, he couldn't think of, you know, one person's life as being greater than another person's life just because they have different class backgrounds. You know, a middle class university professor's life isn't necessarily greater than somebody who works in the mill. Their life has meaning also, and he could really encapsulate that.
Yeah, he grabbed onto those things. His critics would read a poem like that and say, I can understand this the first time reading through. This is not great poetry, right?
That's right. That's right. It's a very, very accessible writer, too. Yeah.
Is that part of why he wasn't a more recognized figure in Canadian literature?
Well, recognized by who? I guess that's my question. I think one of the great things about Nowlan is he's recognized by, it depends on who you're talking about. He's not necessarily recognized by people who like more refined poetry or more obscure, sophisticated poetry. Exactly. Yeah, his poetry, because it's very accessible, tends to be, I think, unjustly neglected by people who study poetry. And at the same time, but that accessibility gives it power among an audience that ordinarily wouldn't read poetry.
Yeah. Well, now your book is out there and people will know more about Alden Nowlan. Take us back to 1933.
Yes.
He was born in Nova Scotia, Stanley, Nova Scotia. His mother was 14.
That's right.
What
she
were
was
the
a couple months
circumstances?
shy. Well, she had met a man who was twice her age at the time. A man named Freeman Nowlan, who was a mill hand. Of course, the mill in Stanley was only open for 4 months out of the year, so he was a mill hand for 4 months, and he was an axeman in the woods for the rest of the time. And So he was very poor. He didn't have a regular paycheck coming in. Never had a year-round job. So they met, probably at one of those dances that they had in the community, and she got pregnant by him, and they agreed, as many people did in those days, to do what they considered to be the right thing, and got married. But the marriage quickly fell apart.
And there comes Alden Nowlan into the world. He goes to school and he quits at grade 4 or grade 5? Which was it?
Well, he said grade 5. He always said grade 5.
But it was only like a few days.
Well, according to the records that I've been able to find, he only went to grade 4, but that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't. He may have gone to grade 5 for a few days, and maybe they didn't keep records of it then. Whatever the case, he was out of school by the time he was 11 or 12.
Wow, which is an amazing thing for a writer of this accomplishment. He decided he had to work, so he's back at the sawmill, like his father, I suppose.
Yeah.
Tough, rough kind of a life, I would
Yeah,
gather.
and not a literary life either, not one that encouraged a lot of reading. The nearest library was in Windsor, which was 20 miles down the road. So, he had to educate himself.
He read voraciously, though. He'd take books. What kind of books was he reading from the library?
Oh, anything. He read. Well, he didn't get his comic books from the library, but he would read, encyclopedia, whatever he could lay his hands on. And it's the same thing going back to he didn't distinguish between one type of person being more important than another type of person on the basis of sophistication. And he had the same approach to literature and to the type of culture that he liked. He read comic books in the same spirit as he read the Bible. The great classics of literature alongside pulp fiction. I mean, he loved it all.
A very democratic poet of sorts in that regard. In the tradition of Walt Whitman, perhaps?
Yes, yeah,
Did he see himself
definitely in
at
that
all?
way, yeah. And Whitman was a great influence on him, so he was democratic in his tastes and also in what he produced.
Now, he got a job as a reporter in New Brunswick, I think around the age of 19. How did he pull that off if he didn't have the formal education?
He lied. He did what he he developed this ability very early in life to invent himself in ways that were pleasing to him and pleasing to other people. So he made up this resume. Actually, he did write a few articles for the Windsor Tribune, and he had somebody there working at the Windsor Tribune who was a friend of his. And so he managed to get a hold of some stationery, wrote himself a letter of recommendation, got the guy to sign it, and made up a resume, and that's all there was to it.
Did that element of fabrication or lying, did that follow through in Alden's life in any way beyond the first job?
Oh, yes, definitely. He during his first years at that reporter's job, which was in a small town called Hartland, New Brunswick, he would go home, for example, every year for his vacation, and he dreaded going home to Nova Scotia. He had such a hard upbringing.
Yeah, he had a pretty bad view of our province here, didn't he?
That's right, he did.
He had such a bad experience.
Yeah, that's right. But the reason he went home was just out of a sense of duty, because he didn't want to explain to his coworkers at the Heartland newspaper why he wasn't going home for his vacation. See, that was a proper thing to do. So he went home so he wouldn't have to explain to his people back in Heartland, why he was avoiding the place.
Yes.
His mother's existence was probably one of his greatest fabrications. He kept the secret of her existence a secret for many years, even from his own wife.
Wow. How well did he fit in Heartland?
Oh, very well. He was seen as kind of a bit of a misfit, but they saw him in kind of a humorous vein. He was a character. People saw him as a character. And he fit in there quite well because he could go along with it. He can make people laugh. And, people just sort of shake their heads at some of his odd ways. His eccentricities. But there were a lot of eccentrics in small-town New Brunswick, and so he just sort of became one of them. Fit in quite well. I
would imagine that he did. Although he always saw himself as a bit of an outsider,
yes.
I believe. And he used that as an artist and a poet. In what way is the outsider there in the poetry of Alden Nowlan, do you think?
I think he regards himself as an observer, somebody who sees humanity as if he's somebody from another planet. There's a good short poem that I'd like to read about that.
Yeah, go for it.
It's one called, if I can find it here.
Of course, he used a lot of his skills as a reporter and as a journalist, I think, in observing people to bring that into the poetry that he wrote about, which was very character-driven.
Yes, that's right. And he could see the other characters. one of his finest collections in this anthology is called Under the Ice, and it's about a string of characters that he can observe with that keen reporter's eye of his. Here's a good poem called Disguise, which explains how he felt as an outsider. This is the amazing thing, that it is so easy to fool them, the sane bastards. I can talk about weather, eat, preside at meetings of the PTA. They don't know. Me, foreign as a Martian, with the third eye in my forehead, but I comb my hair cleverly, so it doesn't show, except a little sometimes when the wind blows.
Yeah, that reference to Martians, I think, has come up in something else, another poem I remember of his, and it's just, that's far out.
Flossie at school.
Yeah, how far
it's
outside he sees himself. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. He describes another girl that he went to school with as also being called the Martian. Yeah, he sometimes saw himself as somebody from another planet.
When was he first publishing poetry?
He published his first poem when he was 17. 17 or... It was in 1951.
A
anyway,
local
17 or
publication
18.
or a little poetry magazine?
No, a magazine way on the other side of the continent in Oregon, which was called the Gruntvig Review. And the poem was called The Mists, and it was just awful. And he wrote really awful poetry for probably about the first 10 years of his career. And there was a lot of it.
I think all poets do. I think everybody starts writing bad poetry.
Yeah. So in a way, it's good that he became an American little magazine poet.
Yes.
Because nobody who knew him ever read those magazines, and they were far away. So he could write all his awful poetry and get out of his system, and nobody would know.
What about the first book?
His first book was one that Fred Cogswell, who was a professor at the University of New Brunswick, helped him publish. It was a fiddlehead book called The Rose and the Puritan. And it had some of the better examples of those early poems that he had. This book came out in 1958. It was his
Probably a
first.
skinny little book of poetry. My
16
guess would
poems
be
long.
16?
16 poems long. And, it was immediately a hit across Canada. People could see there was something different.
Something very original there. Why do you think he was writing poetry? Because poetry is certainly not the people's forum for expression for the most part.
Yeah, well, I think he wrote lots of stuff. He wrote his newspaper articles at the same time he was writing his poetry. We can't forget that he had parallel careers. And also he wrote a novel shortly after Rose and the Puritan came out. So it wasn't just poetry. I think Nowlan just liked to write many different things, and poetry was one of those very short things. He had kind of a short attention span when it came to writing literature, maybe as a result of his newspapering career. He didn't do very well at longer, sustained work, so poetry was something short that he could do in one sitting.
The novel that he wrote, is that the one that was published or the one that was put away
Well,
for years?
that was one that was put away for a few years and then is published after his death. That's a novel called The Wanton Troopers.
Right, but that's a long time for a book to sit without readers. Why didn't that find publication while he was alive?
Well, I think Nowlan felt that it hit a little too close to home. And the book mentions his relationship with his mother a lot. We have to remember that his mother abandoned the family when Nowlan was only 7 years old. And that was like the central event in his life, and it hurt him so much. That's the reason why he kept his mother's existence a secret for so long. And I think it's because the book deals with his relationship with his mother, and that's the reason why he kept it secret. He didn't push the publication of that book.
The Wanton Troopers, that was called, right?
The Wanton Troopers.
Now, did he carry the weight of that tragedy of the early years of his life with him through his entire career, his entire life?
Yeah, throughout. And he kept the secret of his mother's existence a secret throughout. He would tell people that his mother died when he was very young. And in a sense, she was dead to him.
And she's still alive today.
Yes, she is.
She's outlived Alden.
Yes, she has.
We're going to take a short break right now. My guest is Patrick Toner, and we're talking about the life of Canadian poet Alden Nowlan. And we'll be back right after this. Welcome back back to Off the Page. My guest today is Patrick Toner. We're talking about his new book, which is the biography of Alden Nowlan. Who were some of those early influences on Alden Nowlan? Once he found his way to New Brunswick, Fred Cogswell was obviously one who published his first book, but he began to connect with the literary world. Who were some of those important people?
Irving Layton was a big one. Irving Layton wrote the type of poetry that Nowlan liked to read. He wrote in a very self-confident voice that Nowlan liked, adopted to, and Irving Layton also had a persona as being a poet of the people, which is what Nowlan liked. Also, Ray Souster in Toronto was another big influence. Again, for pretty much the same reasons, because they took their reality and molded something poetic out of it. If you take a look at a lot of Nowlan's early dreadful poems, it's when he was writing about a world he knew nothing about. He wrote a lot of, I guess, science fiction and fantasy type of poetry. And Ray Souster, Irving Layton, Fred Cogswell, they taught him how to take his own reality and make art out of it. So that was very important to him.
Amazing. What did Alden Nowlan believe in?
What did he believe in?
Yeah, it's a large question, but
it is a large question.
It's important to who he is. What were the things that kept him going?
I think he found it important to connect himself to a mythological and historical context. He worked at this assiduously throughout his life, connecting himself to historical events. He writes a lot of poems about what it means to be a Canadian, what it means to be a maritimer. And in one of his last collections, which was written in 1977, called Smoked Glass, he reaches, I think, what's kind of an apotheosis of this development of what it means to be a Canadian, what it means to be a maritimer, and he sort of connected himself to that tradition. So that was always very important. I think tradition and the past and honoring those traditions that have been built up there were always very important to him.
And there's an Irish connection there too that goes back into his heritage, that he sees himself. And when he deals with God in his poetry, it seems like very much there's a personality of God. God is the person, and sometimes it seems like a punishing God or a kind God, but I see a very private, kind of non-traditional religious relationship between the poet and God.
Yeah, well, no real clear picture of God emerges from his poetry. I think it goes through different stages. I think his early poetry, he's dealing with an Old Testament God. And in his middle phase, this is oversimplifying, but in his middle phase, he deals a lot with New Testament God. He writes a lot about Christ, Jesus, the idea of sacrifice. Certainly one of his best-known poems, The Bull and Moose, is...
beautiful poem.
Yes, beautiful poem. And it talks a lot about the Christ-like, sacrifice of an outsider. So he identifies with Christ a lot in that middle period of his poetry. And then in the last period of his poetry, he becomes more superstitious. He sees religion a lot as a kind of a superstition, and so a lot of pagan type of preoccupations come out in his later poetry, folk beliefs of people.
Yeah. Safe to say that he wasn't a teetotaler. This was
No.
a hard drinking man.
Yes.
How did the booze influence his writing, or how did it shape his life?
Well, I'm not sure if it affected his work habits. In fact, I don't think it did. He was, to give him credit, he was always able to get drunk the night before, get up at his normal time, and put his day of writing in. He was always able to do that. But of course, how it affected his health and how it affected his relationships with other people is a much different story. It hurt him in that respect. It separated from people. It kept him at distance. He annoyed and angered many of just about all of his friends at some point in his life.
He had other health problems too, though, that made his life fairly difficult. What were the main things there? Well,
primarily, of course, it was a battle with cancer during the 1960s. In 1966, he discovered that he had cancer of the thyroid gland, and he had to have an operation to have that removed. And so that was his primary health challenge. And it affected his voice, and it affected his physique, the loss of the thyroid, and that influenced, his health for the rest of his life.
You mentioned it at one point there when the cancer was catching up with him, always spending time in the hospital, that he was contemplating suicide.
Yes, that's right, he was.
Why?
I think he saw it, again, it goes back to Nowlan's embracing of tradition, but he saw something, I think he saw something noble and romantic, first of all, about sacrificing himself, because he didn't want to die without dignity, right? Dignity was very important to him. He didn't want to die, in pain. He didn't want to die, shot up with a whole bunch of drugs. He wanted to die as a human. And so he resolved that if the pain got to be too much, he would actually commit suicide. He said that the way he'd like to do that is to walk out into the ocean at a beach close by St. John.
Yeah, but of course he didn't. He died in 1983.
83. So many years after.
What were the circumstances of his death?
He died eventually. Again, it was probably the drink that contributed to that. Nowlan, as it turned out, had been battling pneumonia for the last couple months of his life. He'd probably been walking around with it. It was, it's something you can walk around with. It was getting serious. He was having breathing problems. And to relieve his breathing problems, he would go into the shower, and the steam would help him breathe. And what happened one morning is that he collapsed. This was in June. He collapsed in the shower, and because of the breathing. And so they called an ambulance. And the stress of the whole event, as they were loading him into the ambulance, he took a stroke. Okay, and when they took him up to the hospital, this goes back to his cancer operations. The operations to remove the thyroid gland and other things in his neck, they had to reroute some of the blood vessels in his neck, and as a result, they couldn't revive him. So the blood clot, couldn't be worked out. So he went into a coma, and that contributed to it too. So it was a combination of the stroke and pneumonia.
And he was 50 years old?
50 years old.
50, yeah, still a relatively young man.
That's
well,
right.
He had a powerful impact on writers.
Yes.
While he was alive and when he died.
Yes.
What kind of effect?
I think he had a great impact personally when he could meet a writer in person. The funny part is that the writers that he knew and influenced gave up very early on the practice of taking the poems to him. You've probably had young writers taking their poems to you and
yes.
saying, look at these poems, tell me what you can do.
Yeah.
Typically, the writers who got to know Nowlan, the young writers, only did this once, and because Nowlan didn't really have much to offer them in terms of actual technical poetic advice, but he had lots to offer in the terms of what a poet was and what a poet, how a poet acted and how a poet believed, and he had a circle of young poets that followed him religiously.
Yes. We're going to take one final short break, and we'll be back with Patrick Toner right after this. You've been watching Off the Page today. We've been talking about Alden Nowlan, Patrick Toner, my guest. Alden Nowlan also helped create something called the Flat Earth Society.
That's right.
Why?
Yes, he did. He and Leo Ferrari, a professor at the campus. This is a very stressful time in Nowlan's life. He was very fed up with the academics there. So they said, we're going to create our own academic society to prove that the Earth is flat. And it was all an effort to try to upend some conventional wisdom and to poke fun at the university.
Why do you think that Alden Nowlan remained the misunderstood poet?
Because he wasn't fashionable, and he did buck those fashionable trends. In fact, if he discovered a trend, he would almost purposely kind of go against it. And that's the reason why, he didn't play by society's rules.
Truly a one of a kind.
Yes, unique.
Patrick, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Leslie.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.